I'm a firm believer that everything happens for a reason. And I'm really excited to share this particular video with you from our series called Stories from the Mouth of the Columbia River. This particular story was the spark that actually connected Gary Kobe's to myself and ultimately helped create the team that is now working on our feature-length documentary that we hope to call Taming the Mouth. Gary's program, called Rails in the Surf, he had done numerous times over the years in public, but it had never been recorded. And we wanted to honor and thank Gary for the efforts he put into this awesome program. We have recorded it and are presenting it here for your enjoyment and for others to see and better understand the context of what we are seeking to tell as a feature part of our story. Please enjoy this special presentation by Gary Kobe's of Rails in the Surf.
The presentation is called Rails in the Surf, and it's reshaping the mouth of the Columbia River, and it's the story of a world-class engineering project. At the time of the discovery of the Columbia River, and for many, many eons before that, the mouth of the river was about 6 miles wide from what we now call Point Adams on the south to Cape Disappointment on the north. It remained that way until 1885, when the Corps of Engineers began the process of building the jetty. The first detailed charts of the mouth of the river were done in about 1840 by the Wilkes expedition. And there were 2 channels in, a south channel and a north channel, and they were split by what was called the Middle Sands. So what drove the need for the jetties? Between 1850 and 1940, the population grew from less than probably 20,000 people to almost 3.5 million, and that's Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. California population added to that takes it up almost to 10 million people in that same period. There was lumbering, wheat production, farm products, and all of that was being generated here. Some consumed here, but most of it was being shipped elsewhere, primarily to California, but also to the East Coast. So the merchants in the area began prevailing on the Corps of Engineers to improve the mouth of the river because the passage over the existing bar was very dangerous. And sometimes the ships would have to wait offshore for a couple of weeks to be able to get a break in the weather to make the passage, and outbound the same thing. They sometimes waited here for a month for good weather to be able to get the ships out safely. As the area was growing, also the production was growing inland, so the pressure was just continuing to grow. The Corps of Engineers started looking at it probably in about 1880, and by 1885 the Congress had passed the initial harbors, and there's an act that they passed, and that was the funding for the project. And it was really a series of projects. And the first one was the construction of the South Jetty from 1885 to 1895. And then as they worked on it, they learned more about the requirements. And the project kept growing. And so in 1895, when they stopped, they observed the work that they had done for the first 10 years, and then they started the extension of the South Jetty. But it was more than just an extension or a lengthening of the jetty. It was taking the original jetty, which was a mid-tide jetty, which meant that it was exposed at mid-tide but fully covered at high tide, and converted it to a jetty that would remain above the water at high tide. And that took another 10 years to do that. And so by that time it was 1913. Then they started the construction of the North Jetty, which took till 1917. It was not as long, but nevertheless almost as challenging as the South Jetty. And then in 1930s there was a series of projects. There were the construction of the Sand Island pile dikes and the reinforcing projects of both the North and the South Jetty by this time, which had been exposed to about 20 or 30 years of hard weathering, and they needed reinforcement. And then in 1938, they started the Jetty A project, and that completed the jetty system as it exists today. And then it was primarily the maintenance of the jetties plus the maintenance of the channels at a consistent navigational depth. In addition to the jetty projects, the Corps of Engineers improved or built new defensive forts at Fort Canby on the north side of the river, Fort Stevens on the south side of the river, and then Fort Columbia also on the Washington side. At the time the jetty was being built, the problem was that the South Channel, which came around Point Adams, flat that was exposed at low tide, and generally the prevailing winds are from the south here, and so a ship inbound would have to come in and basically make a large U-turn to get around Point Adams upriver. In the North Channel, there was a narrower channel, and you had to go around the middle sands, which were right in the middle of the river. Then you had the swells that were coming in from offshore, and so it just made for difficult navigation, and so a lot of ships were damaged or lost, and those that made it out often did so with loss of some freight or some damage. So the solution was to build the jetty, and the Corps Corps of Engineers, which was the U.S. Engineers at the time, it really preceded the what is now the U.S. Corps of Engineers, looked at ways to do this, and they first thought they would construct a large pile jetty by just simply driving piles in, and they were thinking about building about 8,000 or 10,000 feet of piles along the course of the river to try to train the current to wash the solids out that were coming down from upstream. And they concluded that trying to use a pile driver on a raft that was going up and down in the swells and the current was not a good solution, and so they chose the narrow gauge railroad, which they'd used on other projects all over the country, as the means to build this jetty. So that was the beginning. Our tendency is to rely on what we can visually observe, and the jetties that we see there today are what we see. They're visual manifestations of engineering and construction that took place 120 or 30 years ago. And the part that's not visible is what the effort that was put into building the jetties was also there to shape the base of the river, which would always be below the current. And so they were also looking at the bathymetry of the river. There's a series of maps starting in 1792 that run to about 1950 that show the changes in the river. Along with the river changes, there was also a change in the landform. And in 1885, before the construction of the dikes, we had the middle sands in the river, and we had had the two channels, and Point Adams was just a round spit of land going out into the river and dying out, and you had Cape Disappointment on the north, sitting on the lava flows that were there. And once they started the construction of the jetties, by 1896, Clatsop Spit was beginning to form around the jetty, and land was accreting there. By 1902, the land had accreted on the ocean side of the jetty and filled in a significant portion of that tide flat that the jetty was built on. And Clatsop Spit was emerging on the north side of the jetty. By 1913, this was well established. Jetty extended out into the river to where it currently is today. Although now there's a gap between that end of the jetty and the jetty that's being maintained ends. Then in 1914 through 1917, the Corps constructed the North Jetty. By the time that was completed, the Benson Beach area on the north side of the North Jetty begun to accrete and fill in, and the Long Beach Peninsula also underwent about 1,000 foot of accretion of new ground, basically because of the redefined channel and the way that distributed the water and the sediments out into the ocean. And the beach south of the South Jetty also accreted a significant amount of land. And so you can see, when you look at the original 6-mile gap in the mouth of the river, it was narrowed down to 2 miles, and that's what it's maintained at today. In 1885, the outer face of the bar was approximately 3 miles west of Cape Disappointment. Construction of the jetties forced the bar further into the ocean, so that by 1900, the outer face had advanced 1 mile, and by 1950, the extreme western position of the sea face of the bar was over 5 miles west of Cape Disappointment. As the outer perimeter of the bar advances into the ocean, the original depth of water increases and the rate of advance becomes less. And that was taken from R.E. Hickson and W. Rodolph's History of the Columbia River Jetties, and those two gentlemen were engineers with the Corps of Engineers in the 1930s. So how did they do it? The Corps of Engineers built a model that shows us how they did it. This image shows the trestle being built out into the to the water, and this trestle had on top 2 parallel sets of rails that were 13 feet center to center. On those rails, they had a giant pile driver that was mounted on 4 flat cars, and then they brought trains with logs for more pilings, beams for constructing the pile bents, and building the base for the rails on top of these bents. And so this structure was advanced out into the water 16 feet at a time. Each bent was 16 feet out from the last one. And then they slowly filled in with stone between them. But before the stone went down, they laid fascines, and a fascine is a round structure. The ones they used here, were about 18 inches to 2 feet in diameter and about 16 feet long. and those were lowered in place and laid on the ocean floor, and then they laid the rocks on top of those. And the purpose that served was to prevent the sand at the base from eroding away below the rocks. And the willow material, because it was underwater most of the time, would not rot, would stay in the bundles that it was bound into and provide that support for the rock on a continuing basis. The fascine was also used back in Napoleonic times for building battle structures and reinforcing trenches and that kind of thing. And it's just been a long-term use by the military. Here we see the fascines being lowered into place and then followed up with loads of rock that are being dumped down, and they would initially pour smaller rock down there and then cap it with large rock. Here are drawings that show the jetty design between 1885 and 1895. The fascines were only laid underneath the bent structure of the jetties, the four pilings with the two parallel rails on top, and under the south side of the south jetty. The north side, according to these drawings, was left just with the stone laid on the sand. As I mentioned before, the first phase of the jetty construction was a mid-tide jetty, where at low tide the top of the jetty was exposed, and at high tide it was underwater. And then after they observed the performance of the first jetty and decided to make it a fully exposed rubble mound training jetty, that's what they constructed the second phase. And it took considerably more material than the first phase, because they couldn't drive piles through stones that were already in place, so they constructed a new set of trestles immediately adjacent to the mid-tide jetty, and then poured stone over that and covered it up, and then filled it to the outside, and so you now had a wider structure that would support a higher top that would always be out of the water. The Corps decided to use the narrow gauge railroad equipment that they'd used elsewhere. It was readily available, it had sufficient power to perform the tasks, and it was proportionally smaller and lighter than the standard gauge locomotives and cars that were also in use at the time. And so the equipment that was required for the construction of the jetties included locomotives, pile drivers, flat cars, dump cars, cranes, and tugs and barges. They had to build a supply chain to provide piles and lumber and fascines and hardware, ties, rail, tools, stone, and fuel. And so it just grew and grew. They had to build receiving facilities for the tugs to barge down the rocks. Needed a service yard and a marshaling yard for the railroad. And they had the trestle itself with all its bents that were pushed out into the water. So the construction of the South Jetty occurred between 1895 and 1913, which is 27, 28-year period. And was done, the first phase, 1885 to 1895, with an 8-year break, and then from 1903 to 1913. And the facilities that were built at Fort Stevens to support the construction of the jetty included a wharf that was built out into the river at the time, the marshaling yards, the jetty itself. At the beginning, the standard gauge railroad was still not serving Astoria, and it was not extended out here. But by about 1902 or 1903, the standard gauge railroad had been extended and also began to bring some of the supplies. This is a map of Fort Stevens in 1899. Shows the wharfing facilities and the structures that supported the jetty. And in 1902, we see by the map here that the standard gauge railroad had been extended out to Fort Stevens from Astoria and now had a yard connecting with the Corps of Engineers narrow gauge railroad. Here's a photo of the South Jetty. It's got a string of loaded dump cars loaded with stone coming from the wharf, and there were a couple of steam generation plants on that wharf to provide power for the crane system that would unload the barges and transfer the rock to these dump cars. This photo is another one of the jetty wharfage. Shows a pretty complex trackage system served by several wharfs. This is a photo of the piling, marshaling, and loading areas where the piles would be brought in, loaded on flat cars, and then taken out to the pile driver, which was out at the end of the jetty driving the piles for the new bents. This is a photo of a small locomotive pushing flat cars with men dumping stones, rubble stones off of the flat car by hand. This was a little bit tricky because when you get the stone over by the edge of the car, you're slowly transferring the load to the outside, and it has a tendency to tip. And was easy to put smaller stones in place this way, but with the larger stones, a better way had to be found, and we'll get to that in just a moment. This is a photo of the Corps of Engineers order to Baldwin Locomotive Works for 6 locomotives. They had a number of different names for these. They named them after local areas like Clatsop and Tillamook, Willapa, and several other places. The detail on the order shows that these locomotives were to be operated in a harsh area. It says that effort is to be made to protect all of the metal on the locomotives with proper coatings. This is a photo of a Baldwin 042 locomotive that was used at Fort Stevens. And 042 refers to the wheel arrangement of the locomotives. 0 means there are no front or pilot wheels on it. The 4 is the 4 driving wheels, and then the 2 or the 2 trailing wheels under the cabin of the locomotive. Here we have a series of 4 locomotives that are in the yard there, and on the right is locomotive number 4, and locomotive number 4 has the distinction of being the only locomotive to go to sea to rescue shipwreck survivors. On the early morning of January 13, 1912, in foul weather, the 683-ton 4-masted lumber schooner the Admiral ran into the western portion of the southern jetty, then which was still under construction, about a year away from being completed. Another ship crossing the bar saw the wreck and sent a wireless message to the U.S. Life-Saving Service at Point Adams. And one of the men from the life-saving station hurried to the jetty construction office. As luck would have it, locomotive number 4 had been fired up for yard work and was ready to go. And 4 men took the locomotive out on the jetty trestle. And the strong winds and huge seas made poor visibility and for treacherous progress. They soon encountered the first mate of the Admiral clutching a small boy under his coat. It was the son of Captain Bender, the skipper of the Admiral. And further down the trestle, 3 more survivors were sighted: Captain and Mrs. Bender and the ship's cook. And they were quickly taken into the warm cabin of the locomotive. The Admiral had passed all the way through the jetty trestle, and the remaining survivors were on the far side of the 200-foot breach in the jetty. The locomotive returned to the yard and picked up 2 flat cars, which were pushed ahead of the locomotive, and the lead car had a Lyle life-saving gun mounted on the deck of the flat car. And a Lyle is a small cannon that fired a rescue line over long distances. And the crew of the life-saving service returned and got the line over to the survivors, and one by one rescued all of the remaining 7 people. The Admiral had been washed through the breach and washed up on Peacock Spit to the north, and a salvage attempt was thwarted by heavy seas, and the ship became a total loss. And this was the only time in history where a locomotive went to sea to come to the aid of a ship in distress. This is a photo of locomotive. It's an 044 locomotive, no front drivers, 4 driving wheels, and 4 wheels under the cab. And it's locomotive number 6. And this picture is on the South Jetty. And later on, there'll be another photo of it involved in construction on the North Jetty. And here it's pushing a flat car out for dumping rock. This is a photo of the same locomotive on the north side of the river and the construction of the North Jetty. Pile drivers. This is a smaller pile driver, and it appears to be repairing the 1885 to 1895 structure, and we can see Point Elise off in the background. This photo is of the large pile driver, the one mounted on 4 flat cars. The boom is probably 70 to 80 feet high. The rails that it rode on were about 30 feet above water level, or the sand floor of the river. And so the top of this pile driver would be about 100 feet in the air when the tide was out. Here we see the large pile driver lifting a dump car that fell off of the jetty, recovering it, bringing it back up on the tracks. I would think probably a couple of times a year they lost some cars that they had to recover. This photo is taken on the North Jetty and shows the pile driver at work, and on the backside of the pile driver is a house with a boiler in it, a giant counterweight to offset the weight of the pile driving structure, and a lifeboat hanging on the back of the house. Again, flat cars were used for dumping rubble stone and carrying logs for the pilings that were driven. Here's a locomotive pushing a set of piles out to the pile driver, which is working on the jetty structure. And here's a flat car loaded with trestle timbers and hardware up at the yard on the North Jetty. Then there were the dump cars. This became a very useful car in the process, and it was designed by a young draftsman who was working on the South Jetty. You can see that the car has a set of wheels on each end and has a framework with a pallet between it and a wheel on one end, a hand wheel. And so you would load the rock onto the dump car, and then when you got out, you'd turn the wheel, and it would slowly tilt the floor of the car up, and the understructure of the car would rest on the railroad ties, and that would stop the car from turning over, and then the rock would slide off and be incorporated into the jetty. Here's a load of rock being marshaled and waiting to go out onto the jetty. This photo is of a string of rock dump cars well out on the extension of the South Jetty. Working conditions out here were sometimes simply foul and dangerous, and you can see the turbulence of the waves. And again, this is taken from the extreme end of the South Jetty, looking back in. Again, here's another photograph of a number of cars that came off of the trestle and landed on the ocean floor. They were recovered and probably rebuilt and or incorporated, used for parts in other cars. This is a picture of the steam tug Samson landing 3 barges, and a significant portion of the stone in the jetties came from the Fisher Quarry up in Vancouver, Washington, and was brought down river. And the barges are well loaded with rock. They would be pushed up to the wharves, and then a crane would pick the rock off and transfer it from the barge to the dump cars. The construction of the North Jetty ran from 1913 through 1917. This is a photograph of the North Jetty receiving wharf. Portions, the pilings from this wharf are still visible there today. It functioned very much the same way that the jetty at the South Wharf did, with stone being brought in on barge and transferred by steam crane onto the dump cars and then taken out and placed. This is a photo of the Fort Canby yard looking back towards the receiving wharf. This is a photo of the Fort Canby yard from Mackenzie Head, and you can observe all of the pilings that are stored on the beach. In the 1930s and 1940s, repairs were made to both the South Jetty and the North Jetty. At the end of that period, Jetty A was constructed new from scratch. Repair of the North Jetty involved the use of the rail tug Mastodon, which was a 368 by 50 foot tug that originally took passenger trains across the river from New Orleans. When a bridge was built here, the tug was brought out here and used for about a year, and it could accommodate 21 carloads of stone. And the stone was coming from a quarry up in the Yelm area and came down to Kalama and was loaded onto the Mastodon and then brought out by tug. By this time, on the North Jetty, the cars would roll off of the Mastodon onto the tracks up here, taken out and dumped, and then the cars brought back, loaded onto the Mastodon and towed up to the quarry, filled with rail, and had this cycle. And the Mastodon brought down about 7,000 carloads of stone. The 1930s also brought the pile dikes, construction of the pile dike, and a pile dike is a series of pilings that are driven into the ground, usually in a staggered fashion, and then bolted together with a long timber. And its purpose is to create an impediment in the water that will slow down the flow or cause a side flow at an accelerated rate that will push sand and sediment out into the main channel. The reason for building these was the base of the North Jetty was slowly eroding. They were trying to prevent that, and so they built 4 pile dikes, all on the Washington side, and the water would back up behind them and then flow out around the ends and slowly create a kind of a cross current into the middle of the main channel. They constructed them and observed them for several years and decided they weren't doing or what they thought they would do. And so they constructed the A jetty, which is perpendicular to the channel of the river, and it accomplished what they wanted to do, which was to prevent the erosion of the base of the A jetty. This is a photograph of the facilities of the Sand Island pile dikes. On the north side of Sand Island, there's a receiving dock, and then they constructed a narrow gauge railroad, and that went out, and they had smaller pile drivers, and they would build these out into the river, and the pile driver would advance. Once they had driven more pilings, they would set timbers and railings on top and advance the course of construction that way. Here's a photograph of the unloading of the stones at the Sand Island Wharf, and there are about 13 or 14 people working in this photo, and it was in the middle of the Depression, and so it was a source of labor and a source of good income for the people working on the project. There were 2 small locomotives involved in the building of the pile dikes. This is the 040 tanker, which is no pilot wheels, 4 driving wheels, and no trailing wheels. It's pulling a series of 4 cubic yard dump cars. This is the early Plymouth gas mechanical locomotive that was also used in the construction. The dump cars were built by a company up in the Puget Sound area and basically handled smaller rock, more basketball sized. Here's a photograph of the pile driver out on the pile dike as the pile dike is advancing into the water. Another one of the pile driver advancing the pile. So from 1931 to 1936, major repairs were made on the South Jetty, including the pouring of the massive concrete jetty cap. And I should point out that that was done with standard gauge railroad. They again built another set of pile bents and poured that. From 1938 to 1940, they worked on the maintenance of the North Jetty, also pouring a large pile cap out there. This was done in concert with the construction of the A jetty and was also done with standard gauge locomotives. By the eve of World War II, the jetties and pile dikes had decisively reshaped the mouth of the river. It had been narrowed from 6 2/3 miles to 2 miles, and a maintained channel depth increased from about 20 feet to more than 40 feet. By this time, nearly 50,000 piles had been driven, probably 140,000 fascines had been fabricated and placed. 12,360,000 tons of rock had been quarried, transloaded, and placed. 20 million board feet of lumber had been used, and there were most likely about 185,000 train operations during the course of this period. And that's the story of the South Jetty. And today, a photograph of Fort Stevens and remnants of the wharfage area in the foreground, and Trestle Bay and the series of trestles that were built in the original jetty, second phase, and the extensions of the repairs to the jetty. This Clatsop Spit and the extended jetty projecting out into the ocean. This is a photograph from the viewing platform at the South Jetty showing the pilings still buried in the stone and the jetty extending out into the ocean. Here's a view across Clatsop Spit to the north and the A jetties. Here's a view of Sand Island today with pile dikes 1, 3, and 5, A jetty and North jetty in the background. A photo of the remains of the North and A jetty wharfing facility. Remains of the jetty A trestles extending out past the Coast Guard base. This is pile dike 5, shown in an aerial close-up. That's the end.
Please take a look at additional content at Stories from the Mouth of the Columbia River. Thank you.